She took the vintage convertible without asking and totaled it within an hour. Mom yelled at me for upsetting her while she was shaken up. I didn't shed a tear. That wasn't my restored classic. It was the $315,000 vintage Porsche rental Dad signed for under his own strict insurance policy. I am Lorraine. I am 34 years old, and my younger sister just destroyed a piece of automotive history because she wanted to look cool for a guy she met 3 weeks ago. Before I tell you about the financial ruin that just hit my mother like a freight train, let me know where you guys are watching from in the comments. To understand why I did not scream, cry, or throw a punch when I saw the wreckage, you have to understand the cars, and you have to understand the family. It was Thursday morning, 2 days before my younger sister Meredith was getting married. The air was crisp, that specific kind of cool you get in late September in New England. I was standing in the detached garage of the massive estate my father, Arthur, had rented for the wedding weekend. It was not just a house. It was a sprawling coastal manor with a driveway that looked like it was designed for car commercials. The gravel was perfectly raked, the hedges were sharp enough to cut yourself on, and the ocean crashed against the rocks just a few hundred feet away. I had grease under my fingernails, despite scrubbing them twice with heavy-duty pumice soap. I was doing a final check on my own car, a 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback. I had spent the last 5 years restoring it. It was not a checkbook build where you just hand someone a stack of cash and point at a catalog. I did the welding. I did the sanding until my fingerprints were practically gone. I did the entire engine rebuild in a cramped garage that froze in the winter and baked in the summer. I used my meager salary from the local restoration shop to buy every single part, week by week, month by month. Every bolt on that car had my sweat and blood on it. It was my absolute pride and joy. I painted it a deep midnight blue that looked pitch black until the sun hit it just right. I was wiping down the chrome front bumper with a microfiber towel, making sure not a single smudge was visible, when I heard the rumble. It was not the throaty, aggressive roar of American muscle like my Mustang. It was entirely different. It was a tight, mechanical purr. It sounded like precision German engineering. I dropped the towel and walked out of the garage just as a flatbed delivery truck pulled up the long, winding gravel driveway. My dad was standing there, his arms crossed over his chest. He was wearing a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my first 3 cars combined. My dad and my mother, Beverly, had been divorced for 15 years. It was a bitter, messy split involving vicious custody battles, endless arguments over alimony, and a lot of shouting matches in the front yard about who got the lake house. Dad rebuilt his life and his fortune with a massive commercial construction empire. He was strict, precise, and had absolute zero tolerance for excuses. Mom, well, we will get to Mom. Dad nodded at me as I walked up. He did not smile often, but his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. That was his version of a warm hug. He looked at the flatbed and then back to me. It is here, he said quietly. The delivery driver lowered the metal ramp, and there it was. A 1958 Porsche 356 Speedster. It was absolutely breathtaking. The paint was an ivory white that looked like liquid cream poured over the metal. The interior was a rich, flawless red leather. The curves of that car were iconic, the kind of timeless design that makes modern cars look like angry household appliances. This was not a kit car or a cheap replica. This was the real deal. A true, numbers-matching vintage survivor. She is beautiful, Dad, I said, my voice dropping a respectful octave as the driver slowly backed it down the ramp. She is a rental, Dad said, his voice clipped and all business. For Meredith. She wanted to drive away from the ceremony in something classic. I pulled a lot of strings to get this specific model. It is from a private collector specialty fleet down in the city. I walked around it, almost terrified to even breathe too heavily on the paint. Do you know what these are trading for right now? I asked him. A real speedster, depending on the engine numbers, you are looking at maybe $4 million easily at auction. Dad nodded, his face deadly serious. $315,000 is the strictly insured value on the contract. Which brings me to the rules. He turned fully to face me, blocking my view of the car. I signed the rental agreement personally. The insurance policy is incredibly specific, Lorraine. It is a commercial policy with a strict, non-negotiable driver clause. I am the only authorized driver. I can drive it to the church, and I can drive it back to the estate for the exit photos with Meredith and her new husband. I drive it to the end of the driveway. They get in for the picture, and that is it. No joy rides. No highway runs. No exceptions. Understood, I said immediately. I mean it, Lorraine, he said, looking me dead in the eye. If anyone else is behind the wheel and even scratches the paint, the insurance is voided completely. We are on the hook for the full replacement value. I need you to keep an eye on it. I have meetings with the caterers, the event planners, and your mother is. He trailed off, looking toward the main house where a silver Lexus had just aggressively pulled into the circular driveway. Your mother is already causing massive headaches. My mother, Beverly, emerged from her car. She was wearing a floral silk dress that was entirely too loud and vibrant for a Thursday morning, and she looked ready for a physical fight. She always looked ready for a fight when Dad was anywhere in the same zip code. Is that it? She asked loudly, walking over, her expensive heels crunching obnoxiously on the gravel. She did not look at the engineering of the vehicle. She did not appreciate the history. She only looked at it as a status symbol. It is so small. Are you sure Meredith and her massive dress will even fit in that tiny thing? Arthur, it is a classic, Dad said, his patience already visibly thinning. It is not a minivan. Mom rolled her eyes dramatically and then turned her glare on me. Lorraine, why are you covered in grease? The wedding guests will be arriving for the welcome dinner tonight. You look like the hired help. I was detailing the Mustang, Mom, I said, wiping my hands on a shop rag I pulled from my back pocket. I wanted it to look good for the wedding procession tomorrow. Oh, that old, loud thing, she waved a hand dismissively in the air. I do not know why you insist on driving that noisy, smelly car everywhere. Valerie is coming today with her new boyfriend, Lance. He is an influencer, you know. Very high profile. He comes from a family with a massive inheritance. We need to make a flawless impression. Valerie is my younger sister. The golden child. The princess. If I was the hired help, Valerie was royalty. She was 25, conventionally gorgeous, and had never held a real job for longer than 6 months in her entire life. She always had grand ideas and startup pitches that inevitably required heavy funding from Mom. While I used my mechanic salary to slowly build a stable life, Valerie burned through her entire college fund on trips to resorts in Tulum, designer handbags, and aesthetic cafes. Is Valerie bringing a car? I asked, already knowing the dreaded answer. Her BMW is in the shop, Mom said quickly. A little too quickly. Transmission issues again. She is catching a ride up here with Lance, but she will need a vehicle for the weekend to get around town. I told her you would help her out. My stomach instantly tightened into a knot. Mom, my daily driver sedan is back in the city. I only brought the Mustang up here. Well, she cannot drive a rental car, Lorraine, Mom snapped. It looks cheap. Lance comes from real money. She shot a venomous glare at Dad. She needs to show him she fits perfectly into his world. She can rent a standard car like an adult, Dad cut in, his voice hard. Or she can take an Uber. You always were incredibly stingy, Arthur, Mom snapped back, her face flushing red. Just because you have a lot of money does not mean you have a heart. She is your daughter. She is 25 years old, Beverly. She is not 12, Dad said, dismissing her completely. He turned back to me. Here are the keys to the Porsche. He handed me a heavy, single silver key attached to a thick leather fob. It looked simple, but it felt incredibly heavy with responsibility in my palm. Put these in the wall safe in my temporary study inside the house, Dad instructed. The code is 1958. Do not give them to anyone. Not the valet, not Meredith, and certainly not your sister. Got it, I said, closing my fist around the key. I watched Dad walk away toward the grand entrance of the house to deal with the florists who were currently unloading massive pillars of white roses. Mom lingered by the Porsche for a moment, running a manicured hand lightly along the driver's side door. It really is a stunning car, she murmured, almost to herself. Valerie would look so beautiful driving this down the coast. Mom, I said, my voice sharp and loud enough to break her trance. Do not even think about it. Dad was not joking. The commercial insurance is strictly for him alone. If Valerie even touches the steering wheel of this car, it is a financial disaster waiting to happen. She pulled her hand back quickly as if the metal had suddenly burned her. Relax, Lorraine. You take absolutely everything so seriously. You get that awful trait from your father. No joy, just endless rules. She stormed off toward the house, her heels clicking aggressively on the stone path. I stood there alone for a long minute, looking between the two cars. My Mustang, dark, aggressive, and a symbol of my relentless hard work. And the Porsche, white, pristine, a symbol of Dad's success and the precarious, fragile image of this entire wedding weekend. I had a bad feeling in my gut. A really terrible feeling. I drove the Porsche carefully into the climate-controlled main garage, parking it safely next to Dad's large rental SUV. I covered it meticulously with the soft, breathable cotton tarp provided by the rental company. Then I locked the heavy garage door from the outside. I walked into the main house, navigated the busy hallways filled with caterers, went straight to Dad's temporary study, opened the wall safe behind the painting, and placed the silver key securely inside. I locked it and spun the dial multiple times to be sure. I felt safe. I thought I had secured the perimeter. But I forgot one massive variable in the equation. I forgot that for 25 years, my mother had been breaking every single rule for Valerie, and she was not about to stop now. The tension in the house was thick enough to choke on. While the catering staff set up long tables and white linens for the rehearsal dinner on the back lawn, I retreated to the small guest cottage located near the edge of the property. I was sharing it with my best friend and business partner, Brenda. She had just gotten a major promotion at our auto shop back home, managing the entire paint department, and we were supposed to be celebrating. Instead, we were bracing for impact. Brenda was standing in front of the small bathroom mirror, tightening her dress and applying mascara. You look like you are waiting for a bomb to go off, Lorraine. Valerie is arriving soon, I said, pouring myself a very stiff glass of bourbon from the small kitchenette. And Mom is already in Project Impress Lance mode. Ah, Brenda nodded knowingly. She knew the entire family history. Hide your wallet. Hide your keys. It was not a joke. It was a literal survival strategy one had developed over 2 decades. Growing up, the family dynamic was crystal clear. I was the older sister, the responsible one, the one who had to be understanding and mature. Valerie was the baby, the sensitive soul, the one who always needed extra help and infinite second chances. I sat on the edge of the bed, the glass cold in my hand, and let the memories wash over me. I remembered the summer I turned 16. I had spent 2 grueling years mowing lawns in the neighborhood and working long shifts at a greasy local diner, smelling like fried food every single day, just to save up $1,500. I bought a beat-up 1998 Honda Civic. It was incredibly ugly. It had rust spots blooming on the doors, the clear coat was peeling, and the interior smelled faintly like a wet dog. But it was mine. I paid for the mandatory insurance, the gas, the frequent oil changes. 2 weeks after I finally brought it home, I walked back from high school to find the driveway completely empty. Mom was standing in the kitchen, casually chopping vegetables for dinner. "Where's my car?" I had asked her, sheer panic instantly rising in my chest. Oh, Valerie missed her bus, Mom said, not even bothering to look up from the cutting board. I gave her the spare key from your dresser. She just went to cheerleading practice. Mom, she does not even have a driver license yet. I yelled. She only has a learner permit. She absolutely cannot drive alone. She knows the local roads perfectly fine, Lorraine. Do not be so incredibly dramatic. She needed to get there on time. Valerie finally brought the car back 3 agonizing hours later. The entire front plastic bumper was hanging completely off, violently scraping against the asphalt as she pulled into the driveway. She had panicked and hit a high concrete curb while trying to avoid a squirrel. I was furious. I screamed at her. I demanded she use her allowance to pay for the repairs. Mom immediately intervened. Not to scold Valerie for driving illegally and destroying my property, but to fiercely scold me. It is just a cheap plastic bumper, Lorraine. Mom had shouted, pulling a crying Valerie behind her. Look at your sister. She is shaking. She is deeply traumatized by the accident. Why do you care more about a stupid, ugly car than your own sister and her feelings? You are being so incredibly greedy. Greedy. That was her absolute favorite word to hurl at me. Whenever I wanted to rightfully keep something I had earned with my own sweat, I was greedy. Whenever Valerie wanted something she had not earned, she was simply in need. It did not stop there. It never stopped. My expensive digital camera? Valerie borrowed it without asking for a weekend trip to the beach and conveniently lost it in the sand. Mom said I should have taken better care of my own things and locked them away. My college laptop? Valerie spilled a giant cup of sticky soda directly onto the keyboard during finals week. Mom said it was just an unfortunate accident and I needed to learn forgiveness. When I proudly graduated from trade school, Dad offered to help me with a generous down payment on a small condo in the city. I flatly refused his money. I knew if I took a single dollar, there would be massive strings attached. Or much worse, Mom would relentlessly guilt me into letting Valerie live in my spare bedroom entirely rent-free because she was trying to find herself. I built my automotive restoration business from the dirt up. I lived in a tiny, drafty apartment, ate cheap instant ramen noodles for dinner, and reinvested every single spare penny into buying better tools. Valerie, on the exact opposite hand, got the massive college fund Dad had set up. She went to a private, ridiculously expensive liberal arts college that cost $60,000 a year. She switched her major 4 different times in 2 years. She formally dropped out in the middle of her junior year because she claimed the academic environment severely stifled her creative energy. She came back home driving a brand new Audi luxury sedan that Mom had secretly co-signed the massive loan for. Dad fiercely tried to intervene. He permanently cut Valerie off financially the second she dropped out of school. That specific action was the ultimate catalyst for the final, most bitter phase of their divorce wars. Mom viewed Dad refusing to fund Valerie and her lavish lifestyle as a direct, vicious attack on her own parenting skills. So, Mom doubled down. She maxed out multiple high-interest credit cards, took out sketchy personal loans, doing absolutely anything to maintain the expensive illusion that her golden child was wildly successful. And now, here we were. Meredith was getting married, and this massive estate was the ultimate theatrical stage for Mom to prove to the world that she and Valerie were thriving. Hey, Brenda snapped her fingers loudly in front of my face, yanking me violently back to the present moment. Snap out of it, Lorraine. We have a fancy rehearsal dinner to attend. Just keep your distance from them tonight. Stick right beside me. We will talk loudly about torque wrenches, transmission fluid, and suspension geometry if Valerie even tries to come near us. I laughed, a short, humorless sound, and downed the rest of the bourbon. We walked together up the long stone path toward the main house. The evening sun was slowly setting over the ocean, casting a brilliant, warm golden glow over the entire estate. It was genuinely picture-perfect. Massive white event tents were set up on the manicured lawn, delicate string lights twinkled in the trees, and waiters in crisp white shirts were smoothly passing out flutes of expensive champagne. Then, a loud, obnoxious rattling noise completely shattered the elegant ambience. A taxi pulled up to the front steps. It was not a sleek black car service. It was a beat-up, yellow local taxi with a damaged muffler that sounded exactly like a machine gun firing. Valerie stepped out first. She looked incredibly expensive. She was wearing a designer silk dress that clung tightly to her, strappy heels, and oversized sunglasses despite the fact that it was literally twilight. But there was a frantic, nervous energy radiating off her. She practically yanked a heavy leather suitcase from the trunk, then turned quickly to help Lance out of the back seat. Lance was handsome, I will give him that. He had perfect teeth and perfectly styled hair. But he already had a large smartphone attached to a handheld gimbal in his hand, actively recording himself stepping out of the cheap taxi. He frowned slightly at the yellow cab, then quickly angled the camera lens up toward the massive mansion, his expression instantly shifting into a bright, entirely fake, dazzling smile. We have officially arrived at the coastal compound. I heard him chirp loudly to his unseen audience on the screen. Mom rushed forward down the steps, practically shoving a poor waiter holding a tray of appetizers out of her way. Valerie, my darling, you finally made it. She hugged her fiercely, then turned her blinding attention to Lance. And you must be Lance. Welcome to our family estate. Please, make yourself entirely at home. I openly winced. It was not our family estate. It was a temporary weekend rental. But Mom was already aggressively spinning the false narrative. I walked over slowly, Brenda flanking me like a bodyguard. Hey, little sister, I said, casually extending a hand. Valerie looked at me, looked at my simple black slacks and blouse, then looked at Brenda. She did not take my hand. Instead, she went for a highly performative, awkward air kiss near my cheek. Lorraine, the resident grease monkey. She let out a high-pitched, artificial laugh. Lance, babe, this is my older sister, Lorraine. She fixes old cars for a living down in the city. I restore vintage classic automobiles, I corrected her calmly, keeping my voice perfectly level. Nice to meet you, Lance. Lance lowered his phone for half a second, looked me up and down, saw I was not wearing any recognizable designer labels, and instantly lost all interest. Charmed, I am sure, he said flatly, immediately looking past me toward the caterers. Valerie, babe, where exactly are we staying tonight? I urgently need to plug in my ring light before I lose this golden hour lighting. Mom has us completely set up in the master guest suite in the main house, Valerie said eagerly. Then she turned back to me, taking a step closer, her voice dropping to a loud, frantic whisper. Hey, look, about that embarrassing taxi right up here. Super humiliating. My BMW is, currently getting a custom matte black vinyl wrap. I could not bring it up, right? The transmission issue, I said, raising an eyebrow. She blinked rapidly, flustered. Yeah, that too. Whatever. Listen, Mom said you proudly drove that loud Mustang up here today. Can I please get the keys just for tonight? I really want to take Lance down to the harbor for expensive cocktails later. Show him the local coastal sights in style. There it was. It took exactly 5 minutes. 5 literal minutes of being in my presence before she asked for my property. No, I said flatly. Come on, Lorraine. Do not be like that. It is a really cool car. Lance absolutely loves those vintage aesthetic vibes for his feed. The Mustang is a heavy manual transmission, Valerie. You literally cannot drive stick. You completely stripped the gears on my Jeep Wrangler when you were 18 years old. Do you remember that massive repair bill? I learned how. I am completely good at it now, I swear. No, I repeated, my voice firmer and louder this time. The car is parked safely in the garage. It stays parked and locked until the wedding procession on Saturday afternoon. End of discussion. Valerie's face immediately darkened. The fake, bubbly charm evaporated entirely, replaced by a vicious scowl. "You are such a massive jerk, Lorraine. You always have to be the miserable gatekeeper of everything fun." Mom suddenly appeared right at Valerie's elbow, almost as if she had been summoned by her daughter's minor distress. "What is wrong?" Mom demanded, looking between us. "Lorraine will not let me borrow her stupid Mustang," Valerie whined. She actually, literally whined, stomping her expensive heel on the stone. Mom turned her absolute most furious glare on me. "Lorraine, give your sister the keys right now. She is your guest here. She is your family. She does not know how to safely drive a manual transmission, Mom. And I am absolutely not risking it. It is a 50-year-old restored car. It is not a cheap plastic toy for her boyfriend's internet videos. I do not care about your stupid, loud car." Mom hissed viciously, keeping her voice low so the other wealthy guests mingling nearby would not overhear the drama. "I care about this family looking united, wealthy, and successful tonight. Give her the keys." "No," I said. I turned my back on them and began walking away toward the bar. I heard Mom say something softly to Valerie, soothing her bruised ego. "Do not worry at all, sweetie. We will figure something out. Lorraine is just incredibly jealous of you. She always has been." I walked straight to the bartender and ordered a double bourbon, neat. I genuinely thought I had won that small battle. I thought standing my ground and walking away was the absolute end of the issue. I was incredibly naive. I severely underestimated exactly how far my mother would go to keep the grand illusion alive for a man she barely knew. The rehearsal dinner that night was a hazy blur of forced, tight smiles and the constant clinking of crystal wine glasses. Dad sat stoically at one far end of the long, candlelit table. Mom sat at the complete opposite end. The physical distance between them felt exactly like a heavily guarded demilitarized zone. My sister Meredith, the beautiful bride, looked happy but visibly stressed, her anxious eyes constantly darting nervously between her two parents, terrified a screaming match would erupt over the salmon course. I sat safely near Dad. We talked quietly about his business, about the fluctuating stock market, about absolutely anything except the theatrical drama currently unfolding at the other end of the long table. Valerie was loudly holding court, telling exaggerated, wild stories about her supposed startup ventures that I knew for a fact had completely failed months ago. Lance was actively live streaming his plate of food, ignoring everyone else. Around 9 o'clock, things finally started to wind down. The air was getting colder. Dad stood up from his chair, adjusting his suit jacket. "I am going to turn in for the night. Tomorrow is a massive day. Lorraine, do me a favor and walk the perimeter, check the garage locks before you head back to the cottage." "Will do, Dad," I said. Dad walked inside and went straight to his temporary study on the first floor to make a few quiet business phone calls before heading upstairs to bed. I stayed behind on the patio for another 20 minutes to finish my drink, chat with Brenda, and say a proper goodnight to Meredith. That is exactly when I saw Mom. I was walking through the grand foyer when I saw her quickly coming out of the dark hallway that led directly to Dad's study. She looked incredibly guilty. There is a very specific, shifty look my mother gets on her face when she has just pulled a fast one. Her shoulders were hunched up near her ears, and she was walking entirely too fast, almost power walking. When she suddenly saw me standing by the staircase, she forcefully straightened her spine and plastered a massive, fake smile on her face. "Heading to bed, Mom?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly in the large foyer. Yes, I am absolutely exhausted," she said rapidly. "It has been such a long, draining day." She was clutching her small designer purse tightly against her side, her knuckles actually turning white. "Good night, Lorraine." She hurried quickly past me, practically running toward the grand staircase that led up to the master guest suites on the second floor. I stood there and frowned. My stomach dropped. Something felt incredibly off. The air felt wrong. I slowly looked down the dark hallway toward the study. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of warm light spilling out onto the hardwood floor. I walked over quietly and pushed the door fully open. Dad was not in there. He must have already finished his calls and gone up to his room via the back servant stairs. The room looked completely normal at first glance. The large mahogany desk was tidy, papers stacked neatly. I looked over at the wall behind the desk. The painting was pushed slightly askew. The wall safe was closed. "You are just being paranoid, Lorraine," I quietly told myself, rubbing my tired eyes. She probably just sneaked in there to look for a fancy pen, or maybe to snoop at Dad's financial papers on the desk. She loves snooping. I turned off the lamp and walked outside into the night. The coastal air was salty and freezing cold now. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and walked slowly toward the detached garages. First, I physically checked the heavy padlock on the smaller garage housing my Mustang. I pulled on the metal lock. It was completely secure. Safe. Then, I walked over to the main, larger garage. The one securely housing Dad's rental SUV and the vintage Porsche. I looked at the electronic keypad on the wall. The small indicator light was steadily blinking green. Green meant unlocked. My heart completely stopped beating in my chest. I frantically punched in the access code and hit the heavy button. The massive metal door slowly rolled up, the motor groaning loudly in the quiet night. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered on. Dad's black SUV was parked perfectly on the left side. The right side was completely empty. The space where the pristine, white 1958 Speedster had sat just hours ago was a vacant patch of concrete. The heavy, soft cotton tarp was crumpled and discarded on the dirty floor in a messy heap, looking exactly like a discarded wedding dress. "No," I whispered into the freezing garage. "No, no, no." I spun around and sprinted blindly back to the main house. I did not care about waking anyone up. I threw the front door open and took the grand stairs two at a time, my shoes pounding violently on the expensive wood. I ran straight to Valerie's guest suite down the hall. I pounded my fists on the heavy door. "Valerie! Open the door!" I yelled. No answer. I violently twisted the brass handle. Locked tight. I sprinted further down the hall, to Mom's massive bedroom. I did not bother knocking. I grabbed the handle and burst forcefully into the room. Mom was sitting calmly at her ornate vanity mirror, wearing a silk robe, slowly removing her heavy makeup with a cotton pad. She jumped out of her chair, dropping the pad onto the floor, clutching her chest. "Lorraine! What on earth is wrong with you?" she shrieked. "You nearly gave me a heart attack." "Where is she?" I demanded, my entire body shaking with a blinding, terrifying rage. "Where is Valerie?" "She went out for a drive," Mom said calmly, turning her back to me and sitting down to face the mirror again. "She and Lance wanted to see the beautiful coastline illuminated by the moonlight. It is very romantic." "With what car, Mom?" I screamed, taking a threatening step into the room. "With what car?" Mom sighed heavily, rolling her eyes in the mirror, picking up another cotton pad and dabbing lazily at her cheek. "I solved the transportation problem, Lorraine. Since you were being so incredibly selfish and stubborn with your Mustang, I simply found the spare keys to your other car. The little white one." The room physically spun around me. My vision blurred at the edges. "My other car? Mom, I do not own a white car." "Do not be completely ridiculous, Lorraine," she waved her hand at me in the mirror. "I saw it parked in the large garage this afternoon. The little white convertible. I found the silver key sitting right on your father's desk in the study. He must have carelessly left it out." "Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a hoarse, terrified whisper. "That is not my car." "What?" She paused, her hand freezing near her face. "That is not my car," I yelled, my voice cracking. "That is the rental vehicle." The 1958 Porsche Speedster. The priceless antique Dad explicitly rented for Meredith's wedding. She waved a hand again, though her posture stiffened slightly. Oh, whatever. It is just a car, Lorraine. It looks old and loud, exactly like yours. What is the actual difference? The difference, I choked out, feeling like I was suffocating, is that the commercial insurance policy specifically and legally states that only Dad is authorized to drive it. If absolutely anyone else drives that vehicle, the coverage is completely voided. $0. Nada. Nothing. Mom finally stopped. She slowly turned around on the vanity stool to look at me, her face suddenly draining of color. What exactly do you mean? I mean that car is worth $315,000, Mom. I screamed. And you just let Valerie, who has a documented history of reckless driving and destroying vehicles, take it out into the dark for a joy ride on winding coastal cliff roads. You are heavily exaggerating to scare me, she scoffed loudly, but her voice visibly wavered. She stood up, tightening her robe. It is a rental car. All rental cars have standard insurance. Not when you intentionally violate a strict commercial contract. I yelled back. Dad explicitly told me to put the key inside the wall safe. How did you get it? The safe was already open, she lied quickly, her eyes darting away from mine. I knew she was lying. I had locked it myself. She had probably watched Dad carefully punch in the numerical code earlier from the hallway, or she simply guessed it. Dad always predictably used birth years for his codes. 1958 was the year of the vintage car, but it was also the birth year of his absolute favorite architect. Mom knew his lazy security habits perfectly well. Call her, I commanded, pointing a shaking finger at her phone sitting on the bed. Call Valerie right this second and tell her to bring the car back immediately. Tell her to drive 5 miles an hour and pray she does not hit a bug. I cannot, Mom said, her voice finally dropping its arrogant edge, looking nervously at her phone. She told me she was turning her phone completely off. She said Lance wanted a completely disconnected, romantic evening away from screens. I pulled out my own phone with shaking hands. I called Valerie's number. It went straight to a generic voicemail. I hung up and immediately called Brenda in the guest cottage. Brenda, get the keys to your pickup truck, I ordered the second she answered. Meet me at the front door right now. Valerie stole the vintage Porsche. She did what? Brenda gasped. Just get the truck. I hung up. I turned and ran back down the hall toward Dad's master suite. I had to wake him up. I had to tell him immediately. But I hesitated with my hand hovering inches from the heavy oak door. If I woke him up and told him right now, the resulting atomic explosion of his rage would completely destroy Meredith's wedding before it even officially started. Find the car first, I desperately thought to myself. Bring it back safely. Pray to God there is not a single scratch on the paint. Park it. Hide the key. Then tell Dad in the morning after the ceremony. I turned away from his door and sprinted outside into the freezing night. Brenda was aggressively pulling her large Ford pickup truck up to the front steps, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I jumped into the passenger seat before she even fully stopped. Which way? Brenda asked urgently, slamming the truck into drive. Take the coastal road north, I said, my eyes scanning the darkness. She wanted to show off for Lance. She would definitely go toward the scenic cliffs near the lighthouse. We peeled violently out of the gravel driveway, throwing rocks behind us. I looked at the digital clock glowing on the dashboard. It read exactly 10:15 p.m. How bad is this, really? Brenda asked, tightly gripping the steering wheel as we merged onto the pitch-black, winding 2-lane highway. It is a 1958 Speedster, Brenda, I said, my voice trembling. It has old drum brakes. It has absolutely no power steering. It has a heavy rear-engine bias. It is an incredibly tricky, dangerous car to drive fast even if you know exactly what you are doing. And Valerie drives like she is playing a video game, Brenda finished my sentence grimly. We drove in tense, agonizing silence for 20 minutes. I was hyperventilating slightly, frantically scanning the dark road ahead, desperately looking for those distinct, round vintage headlights coming in the opposite direction. Every single time a car passed us, my muscles tensed in pure dread. Maybe she is just cruising slowly, Brenda offered, trying to sound optimistic. Maybe she parked at an overlook and they are just making out in the dark. Valerie does not cruise, I said bitterly. Valerie performs for an audience. Suddenly, my phone buzzed violently in my lap. I snatched it up. It was not a call from Valerie. It was a text message from a completely unknown number. The screen illuminated the dark cab of the truck. A photo slowly loaded on the screen. My stomach completely dropped through the floorboards. My blood turned to absolute ice. It was a poorly lit selfie. Lance was in the passenger seat, holding the phone high, flashing a peace sign. His hair was blowing wildly in the wind. In the background of the dark, blurry photo, Valerie was sitting behind the large steering wheel. She was grinning like an absolute maniac, her teeth glowing in the dashboard lights. But that was not the horrifying part. The horrifying part was the bottom corner of the frame. The camera had accidentally captured the glowing vintage speedometer on the dashboard. "She's doing 85, I whispered, my voice sounding entirely dead to my own ears. "What?" Brenda yelled over the engine noise. 85 miles an hour, I repeated, staring blankly at the screen. In a 60-year-old car with suspension technology from the Eisenhower administration. Where exactly was that photo taken? Brenda demanded, leaning over to glance at my screen. I zoomed in desperately on the blurry background outside the car window. I recognized the specific shape of the rocks illuminated by the headlights. That is the final approach to the lighthouse turn. It is about 5 miles up this road. Hold on tight, Brenda said, her jaw clenching as she pressed the heavy gas pedal all the way to the floor. The truck roared as we accelerated, tearing through the darkness. Every second felt like a suffocating eternity. We rounded the sharp, blind bend near the old lighthouse 3 agonizing minutes later. We saw the violent black skid marks first. Long, jagged, aggressive streaks of burned rubber that snaked sideways across the solid double yellow line in the center of the road. Then, my headlights illuminated the thick wooden guardrail. It was completely shattered, splintered wood jutting into the air like broken teeth. And then, I looked down the steep, dark embankment resting against a massive, ancient oak tree. We saw it. Or, at least, we saw what was left of it. The pristine, $315,000 white Porsche was violently crumpled. The front trunk hood was folded upward like a cheap accordion. The driver's side door was caved in entirely. A thick cloud of white steam was hissing violently from the rear engine bay, swirling in the red glow of the shattered tail lights. "Oh my God," Brenda whispered, slamming on the brakes so hard the truck skidded to a halt on the shoulder. I did not say a single word. I felt a very strange, terrifyingly cold detachment wash entirely over my body. I was not panicked anymore. I was not angry anymore. I was just completely, utterly done. We threw open the truck doors and scrambled desperately down the steep, grassy embankment in the dark. Valerie was sitting on the wet grass a few feet from the wreckage, clutching her left arm tightly against her chest. There was a dark smear of blood dripping down the side of her forehead. Lance was standing over her. He was not checking her injuries. He was not dialing 911. He had his glowing phone held high, actively live streaming the disaster to his followers. We just crashed. Oh my God, you guys. We literally almost died. The car just lost control. Lance was yelling excitedly into his screen, panning the camera to show the smoking wreckage. I ignored him completely. I walked slowly up to the car. It was utterly totaled. The heavy steel chassis was violently twisted out of shape. The front axle was completely snapped in half, the tires pointing in opposite directions. The curved, iconic windshield was shattered into a million tiny, glittering pieces of glass scattered across the leather seats. "Lorraine?" Valerie croaked, looking up at me, her eyes wide, glassy, and unfocused. When she spoke, the heavy, pungent smell of expensive whiskey hit me in the face like a physical slap. "Lorraine, the old brakes, they just completely locked up on me. It was totally a mechanical failure. It was not my fault." I looked at the smoking car. I looked back up the hill at the massive, sweeping skid marks. "The brakes did not lock up, Valerie," I said, my voice eerily calm and devoid of any emotion. "You entered a sharp, decreasing radius turn at 80 miles an hour. You panicked, and you lifted your foot off the throttle entirely. Snap oversteer. The heavy rear engine swung around like a pendulum, and you violently spun out." "My arm really hurts, Lorraine," she moaned loudly, tears finally mixing with the blood on her face. "You are incredibly lucky you are breathing," I stated coldly, looking down at her. "That vintage car does not have modern airbags. It does not have crumple zones. You should be dead." I pulled my phone slowly from my pocket. I did not call Mom to comfort her. I did not call an ambulance, because Lance had finally stopped his live stream long enough to shout that he had already dialed the police and they were on their way. I dialed Dad's private number. It rang 4 times before he picked up. "Lorraine?" Dad's voice was groggy, irritated at being woken up. "It is late, Dad," I said, staring at the crushed metal of the $4 million antique. "You need to wake up immediately. You need to get dressed. And you need to bring the commercial insurance paperwork to the Lighthouse Road. Right now." I hung up the phone. The screen went dark, and I slipped it back into the pocket of my heavy jacket. The freezing coastal wind whipped around us, carrying the acrid, metallic smell of leaking radiator fluid, burned rubber, and hot engine oil. We waited in the dark. Every single minute felt like a suffocating hour. Lance was pacing back and forth on the wet grass, holding his phone high in the air, desperately trying to catch a cellular signal so he could upload his video. He was not checking on Valerie. He was completely consumed by his digital audience. "My battery is at 14%, Lance complained loudly to the empty night air. "This is a complete disaster for my engagement metrics. I need to post this while the adrenaline is still fresh." I did not look at him. I did not speak to him. If I opened my mouth, I would have screamed, and I did not have the energy to scream. I stood perfectly still on the gravel shoulder of the road, looking down at the destroyed $315,000 vintage Porsche. The thick white steam had stopped hissing, leaving only the sickening sound of hot metal ticking as it rapidly cooled in the night air. The driver's side door was crushed inward, perfectly molding to the shape of the massive oak tree. The beautiful, pristine red leather interior was completely covered in shattered glass and dirt. If you have made it this far, please do me a favor, like the video and comment number 1 down below. It lets me know how awesome you are and shows that you are right here with me on this journey. Your support is a massive encouragement and truly motivates me. Drop that one so I can recognize you, and now, let us get back to my story. The distant, high-pitched wail of sirens finally cut through the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves. The flashing red and blue lights painted the dark trees in rhythmic, chaotic bursts of color. 2 heavy police cruisers pulled up, their tires crunching loudly on the gravel, followed closely by a bright yellow ambulance. The paramedics scrambled down the steep embankment first. They checked Valerie, shining a bright penlight into her glazed eyes, asking her standard questions. She was miraculously fine. She was bruised, violently shaken, and complaining loudly about a fractured wrist, but she was entirely alive. The vintage car had taken the massive brunt of the violent impact, crumpling exactly how it was not designed to crumple. A tall, stern-looking police officer named Sergeant Miller walked slowly down the grassy hill with a heavy flashlight. He surveyed the twisted wreckage for a long moment before turning his attention to Valerie. Even from where I was standing near the broken guardrail, I could see Valerie actively swaying on her feet. Ma'am, I need you to step over here, away from the vehicle, Sergeant Miller said firmly. Valerie stumbled forward. I did not mean to crash, officer, she slurred, her words running together heavily. The brakes on that old car just completely stopped working. It is a massive safety hazard. You should sue the rental company. Sergeant Miller did not write that down. Instead, he pulled a small, black breathalyzer device from his heavy utility belt. Have you consumed any alcoholic beverages tonight, ma'am? I had one single glass of white wine at the rehearsal dinner, Valerie lied smoothly, batting her eyelashes in a pathetic attempt to charm him. Just a small toast for my sister. Please blow steadily into the tube until I tell you to stop, he instructed, completely ignoring her terrible performance. Valerie blew into the machine. The machine beeped loudly. Sergeant Miller looked at the small digital screen, and his face hardened entirely. 0.14, he announced flatly. That is nearly double the legal limit. Turn around and place your hands firmly behind your back. As the metallic click of the heavy handcuffs echoed in the cold air, another car came screaming around the sharp bend. It was Mom. She aggressively slammed on the brakes of her silver Lexus, the tires squealing loudly, and practically fell out of the driver's seat before the car was even fully in park. She ran frantically past Brenda, past me, and desperately tried to push her way through the yellow police tape to get to her golden child. That is my beautiful daughter. Let me through right now. Mom shrieked, her voice echoing wildly over the crashing ocean. Valerie. Mommy is here. Ma'am, I need you to step back immediately, Sergeant Miller ordered, holding up a large hand to physically block her path. We are conducting an active criminal investigation. She is severely hurt. She urgently needs a high-quality hospital. Mom yelled, pointing frantically at the small cut on Valerie's forehead. She is being properly evaluated by the paramedics right now, the officer replied calmly. And she is currently under arrest for suspicion of driving under the influence and reckless endangerment of property. Mom spun around violently and saw me standing quietly by Brenda's truck. She marched over, her face completely twisted in pure, unadulterated fury. Why are you just standing there like a statue? She hissed at me, her eyes wide and manic. Do something useful. Talk to the police officer. Tell him the car experienced a massive mechanical malfunction. Tell him you are a mechanic and you know the brakes were faulty. I am absolutely not lying to the police, Mom, I said, my voice empty and hollow. She drank heavily. She stole the keys. She drove recklessly. This is reality. Mom raised her hand as if she was going to physically slap me, but the sudden sound of heavy tires crunching on gravel stopped her. Dad's black luxury SUV pulled up slowly behind the police cruisers. He stepped out of the vehicle. He was not running. He was not frantic. He walked with a terrifying, controlled slowness. He was wearing dark jeans and a thick wool sweater pulled over his sleepwear, but he looked far more intimidating in that moment than he ever did wearing a tailored corporate suit. He walked directly past Mom, past me, past the paramedics, and went straight to the jagged edge of the embankment. He looked down at the crushed white wreckage brilliantly illuminated by the police spotlights. He stared at the $315,000 disaster for 1 full minute in complete silence. Then, he turned slowly to face me. Is she alive? Dad asked. Yes. Fractured wrist, probably a minor concussion, I answered. And the boy? Lance is completely fine. He is live streaming the arrest, I said, pointing to the idiot still holding his phone up. Was she drinking? Dad asked, his voice dead. Yes, I said. Dad simply nodded. He did not scream. He did not throw anything. He just calmly turned around, walked back to the open door of his SUV, and pulled a thick leather folder off the passenger seat. He had brought the commercial rental agreement. Robert, do something. Mom yelled, running over and grabbing his thick sweater. Your daughter is bleeding and they are treating her like a common criminal. She crashed the car, Beverly, Dad said, not looking at her. She stole the vintage vehicle and she crashed it while deeply intoxicated. She did not steal it. Mom yelled back, her voice desperate. I personally gave her the keys. It was a simple misunderstanding. I genuinely thought it was Lorraine's other car. The white one. Dad stopped walking. He turned his head slowly and looked directly at her. You gave her the keys to a vehicle you did not own? I thought it was Lorraine's. Mom waved her arms frantically toward the wreckage. Look at the car, Arthur. It is just a minor fender bender. Lorraine can easily fix it. She fixes old cars all day long. That is exactly what she does for a salary. Lorraine, tell your father you can buff it out. I looked down at the crushed Porsche. The heavy steel frame was violently bent like a pretzel. The expensive engine block was likely cracked straight down the middle. The rare, hand-rolled aluminum bodywork was utterly destroyed beyond recognition. It was not a repair job. It was a total, catastrophic loss. Mom, I said, my voice completely flat. I cannot fix that. Nobody can fix that. Of course you can. You are just being incredibly lazy and vindictive. You want to see your sister suffer. Mom turned back to Dad. Arthur, tell her to fix it. We will happily pay for the replacement parts. It cannot be that expensive. It is an old, tiny car. Beverly, Dad said, his voice dropping to an ice-cold register that sent shivers down my spine. That is a 1958 Porsche Speedster. It is a highly specialized rental. And I am currently holding the strict commercial insurance policy right here in my hand. So claim it. Mom snapped back impatiently. That is exactly why you have expensive insurance, Arthur. Dad opened the heavy leather folder. He pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and clicked it on, shining the bright beam directly onto a thickly highlighted paragraph on the second page. Clause 4.1, Dad read aloud, his voice carrying clearly over the wind. Authorized drivers. Coverage is strictly valid only if the vehicle is actively operated by the primary signatory, Arthur. Operation by absolutely any other party, whether authorized or unauthorized by the signatory, renders all collision and comprehensive liability coverage completely null and void. The renter assumes full, absolute financial liability for the total replacement value of the vehicle. He looked up from the paper, shining the flashlight near Mom's pale face. And then there is the massive DUI clause on page 3. Even if I had somehow officially added Valerie to the policy, the presence of alcohol in her system voids the coverage anyway. Mom blinked rapidly. The horrific reality was still incredibly struggling to sink into her mind. So, what exactly does that mean? It means, I said, taking a slow step forward, that the commercial insurance company is not paying a single dime for that wreckage. You are paying for it, Mom. She let out a high-pitched, incredibly nervous laugh. I do not have the liquid money for a car like that. How much could it realistically be? $20,000? $30,000? $315,000, Dad stated flatly. The heavy silence that immediately followed his words was far heavier than the sound of the crash. The only sound left in the world was the static crackle of the police radio and the rhythmic crashing of the dark ocean below. Mom's mouth opened and closed silently, resembling a fish pulled suddenly from the water. $315,000 for the replacement, Dad added ruthlessly, plus massive loss of use fees, plus heavy administrative fees, plus the expensive legal fees I am going to incur when the rental agency inevitably sues my corporate business. But, Mom stammered, looking wildly between Dad, me, and the smoking wreckage. It is just a car. It is incredibly small. It is a museum-quality collector item, Beverly, Dad said coldly. And you just bought it. Just then, Sergeant Miller walked heavily up the embankment toward us. Mr. Arthur, the driver, Valerie, is being officially placed under arrest for driving under the influence and reckless endangerment. We are transporting her directly to the police station for formal booking after she is medically cleared at the local hospital. No. Mom screamed, a genuine, blood-curdling sound of panic. You absolutely cannot arrest her. It is a massive mistake. She has a bright future. It is no mistake, ma'am, the officer said firmly, not backing down an inch. She blew a .14. That is a serious criminal offense. Mom desperately grabbed Dad's arm again. Arthur, stop them. Call your expensive corporate lawyer right now. Do something to fix this. Dad forcefully pulled his arm away from her grip. He looked past her, looking at Valerie, who was currently being pushed roughly into the back seat of the dark patrol car, her hands cuffed behind her back. Valerie looked utterly terrified now. The alcohol and adrenaline were fading rapidly, and the harsh, cold reality was setting in. She looked through the glass window at us, her makeup smeared, her eyes desperately pleading for a rescue. Dad looked back at Mom. You wanted her to deeply impress the wealthy boy, Beverly, Dad said quietly. Well, she certainly made a lasting impression. Dad turned to the police officer. Do exactly what you have to do, Sergeant. I will meet you at the station in an hour to provide the formal vehicle ownership documentation and the rental agreement. Arthur. Mom shrieked loudly, falling to her knees on the wet gravel. You are abandoning your own daughter. No, Dad said, turning around and walking slowly back to his black SUV. I am finally letting her face the actual consequences of her terrible actions for the first time in her entire life. Mom stayed kneeling on the ground, trembling violently in the cold wind. She looked up at me, tears streaming rapidly down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. Lorraine, please. Please talk to your father. You are the older sister. You have to fix this. I looked down at her. I thought about my midnight blue Mustang sitting safely in the garage. I thought about my first ugly Honda Civic with the broken bumper dragging on the street. I thought about the massive college fund Valerie had completely squandered. I thought about the years of being called greedy and selfish just for wanting to keep what was mine. I cannot fix this, Mom, I said, my voice completely steady. I am just the grease monkey. I turned around, walked back to Brenda's pickup truck, climbed into the warm passenger seat, and shut the heavy door, locking out the sound of my mother crying. The next morning, the bright sun rose over the massive coastal estate as if absolutely nothing catastrophic had happened in the dark. The seagulls were singing loudly. The catering staff was outside setting up rows of elegant white chairs for the afternoon wedding ceremony. But inside the main house, the atmosphere was incredibly suffocating. It felt exactly like a funeral. Valerie was still sitting in a cold holding cell at the county jail. She had not made bail yet because Dad absolutely refused to post the money, and Mom did not have that kind of liquid cash immediately on hand. Lance, the faithful influencer boyfriend, was long gone. He had called an expensive Uber directly from the hospital emergency room and immediately posted a dramatic, heartbroken status update about cutting toxic energy out of his life, before promptly blocking Valerie on every single social media platform. I sat quietly in the massive, marble kitchen, drinking a cup of strong black coffee. Dad walked into the room. He was already dressed in his tailored black suit, perfectly ready for the wedding ceremony. He looked exhausted, the bags under his eyes dark and heavy, but his posture was completely resolute. Is the rental agency formally notified? I asked quietly. Yes, Dad said, pouring himself a large cup of coffee. They are incredibly displeased. They are sending a representative appraiser up here on Monday to assess the total damage, but I have already wired them the full replacement amount to cover the baseline cost. I had to instantly liquidate a massive, profitable bond portfolio to do it quickly this morning. You actually paid it already? I asked, genuinely surprised. I had to, Lorraine. My personal name is on the commercial contract. If I do not pay them immediately, they will formally sue me. They will go aggressively after my business assets and freeze my accounts. It is a massive legal mess. So Valerie just completely gets away with it again, I said, feeling the familiar, bitter anger rising rapidly in my chest. No, Dad said, his voice firm. He put his ceramic cup down on the granite counter. The sharp sound echoed in the quiet kitchen. Not this time. Mom walked slowly into the kitchen. She looked like she had aged 10 years overnight. She looked like she had not slept a single second. Her eyes were violently red and swollen, her expensive hair was messy, and she was still wearing yesterday's clothes. Arthur, she said, her voice raspy and broken. I urgently need $5,000 for her bail money. And we urgently need a criminal defense lawyer. A really good, expensive one. I am absolutely not paying for a criminal lawyer, Beverly, Dad said, not looking at her. And I am absolutely not posting her bail. She can wait until her formal arraignment on Monday morning. She is your daughter. Mom slammed her open hand weakly against the marble counter. She just made a stupid mistake. She committed a serious felony, Beverly, Dad corrected her coldly. And she utterly destroyed a $315,000 asset. The insurance. Mom started to argue weakly. There is absolutely no insurance. Dad roared. It was the very first time I had heard him genuinely raise his voice in over a decade. The sheer volume of it made Mom physically step backward. Because you deliberately stole the key from my private safe and gave it to a heavily intoxicated driver. The commercial insurance is completely void. Well, you are incredibly rich. Mom yelled back, tears starting to fall again. You can easily afford it. Why are you constantly punishing me? Dad reached calmly into his leather briefcase sitting on the island and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a formal legal document with his neat handwriting on it. I fully paid the rental agency this morning, Dad said quietly, sliding the paper across the counter. $325,000, including the immediate administrative fees. Mom let out a massive, shaking breath of pure relief. See? I absolutely knew you would handle it. Thank you, Arthur. I knew you would not let our family down in a crisis. I handled the rental agency, Dad said, his eyes narrowing dangerously. Now, I am handling you. He tapped his finger firmly on the paper. What exactly is this? Mom asked, her relief instantly vanishing. That is a formal promissory note, Dad said. And a legal notice of intent to place a heavy lien on your property. Mom completely froze. My house? You mean the lake house? You own the house on the lake completely outright, Dad explained coldly. It is currently valued at roughly $450,000. You are going to sign this legal document right now, fully acknowledging a massive debt to me of $325,000. You will immediately sell the house to pay me back in full, or I will formally sue you in civil court for grand theft, gross negligence, and property damages. And since you openly admitted to the police officer last night that you personally handed her the keys, it is an incredibly open and shut legal case. You would actually sue the mother of your own children? Mom whispered, looking at him with sheer terror. You deliberately stole from me, Beverly, Dad said, stepping closer to her. You sneaked into my private study, cracked my safe, took a key, and directly facilitated the complete destruction of valuable property that was under my legal care. You risked our daughter's life just to show off for a boy. I did not know it was that specific car. Mom cried out, pointing a shaking finger at me. I thought it was Lorraine's car. Dad looked at me. And that, I said, speaking up for the first time, my voice dripping with cold disgust, is exactly why I do not feel a single ounce of pity for you, Mom. You genuinely thought it was my car. You thought you were stealing my personal property, actively risking my hard work to let Valerie play big shot. You did not care at all if my Mustang got completely wrecked. You only care right now because the final price tag is vastly too high for you to afford. Mom looked wildly between us. She looked completely trapped, like a rat in a corner. I cannot sell the lake house, Arthur. It is literally all I have left from the divorce settlement. Then you absolutely should not have gambled it away on a joy ride, Dad said without an ounce of sympathy. You have two clear choices, Beverly. Sign the promissory note, sell the house, and pay me back every single penny. Or I file a massive civil suit first thing on Monday morning, and I guarantee the police will add grand larceny to Valerie's criminal charges because she took the vehicle without the owner's legal consent. If I pay you. Mom's voice trembled so hard she could barely speak. Will you please help Valerie pay for the lawyer? No, Dad said firmly. The house money pays strictly for the destroyed car. Valerie is a 25-year-old adult. She can easily use a free public defender. She desperately needs to learn that her terrible actions have terrible consequences. Mom burst into loud, ugly, heaving sobs, sinking onto a kitchen stool. You are completely ruining us. No, Mom, I said, walking toward the door to leave. You completely ruined it. You have been actively ruining her for years by never, ever letting her fail. This is just the final bill finally coming due. The expensive wedding went on. It had to. Meredith was absolutely devastated when she heard the news, but she was also incredibly furious. She completely banned Mom from making a toast at the reception. She told Dad to walk her down the long aisle completely alone. Mom spent the entire beautiful wedding sitting alone in the very back row, wearing large dark sunglasses to hide her swollen, red eyes. She did not eat the expensive catered food. She did not dance. She just sat there like a ghost. Valerie spent the entire festive weekend locked in the county jail. She was formally arraigned on Monday morning in an orange jumpsuit. I drove my midnight blue Mustang for the grand wedding procession. Meredith and her new husband sat happily in the back seat. The loud, aggressive rumble of that American V8 engine was the absolute only music we needed. It was not the refined, quiet elegance of the German Porsche, but it was incredibly real. It was strong, it was reliable, and most importantly, it was mine. In the long, difficult weeks that closely followed the wedding, the total dismantling of my mother's grand life officially began. She signed Dad's legal papers. She had absolutely no other choice. She put the beautiful lake house on the active market. It sold fairly quickly, but the real estate market had dipped slightly. After fully paying off her massive debt to Dad and covering the high closing costs, she was left with roughly $150,000. It sounds like a decent amount of money, but for a woman who had not worked a real job in 20 years and had incredibly expensive tastes, it was panic-inducing. She had to immediately pack her boxes and move into a small, cramped two-bedroom apartment near a loud highway. Valerie pleaded legally guilty to the serious charges of DUI and reckless driving. Because it was her very first criminal offense, she miraculously avoided a lengthy prison sentence, but she received strict probation, hundreds of hours of grueling community service, and completely lost her driver license for a full year. She also had a permanent criminal record now. Her grand startup ideas evaporated into thin air. Lance was a distant memory. Dad fiercely kept his word. He did not give Valerie a single dime of support. Valerie had to desperately get a minimum wage job just to pay her steep court fees and mandatory probation fines. She ended up working for a local commercial landscaping company, hauling heavy bags of mulch and digging deep holes in the hot sun. Manual, back-breaking labor. Mom tried repeatedly to guilt me over the phone into helping her. She is digging literal ditches in the dirt, Lorraine. Mom cried dramatically. It is incredibly humiliating for her. It is honest, hard work, Mom, I told her flatly. It will build some much-needed character. I absolutely hate you, Mom said to me, her voice dripping with venom. You and your father. You are both completely heartless. We are not heartless, Mom, I replied calmly before hanging up. We are just completely done paying for the show. 6 long months later, I was working late at my auto shop in the city. I was deeply focused on rebuilding the complicated carburetor of a 1969 Jaguar E-Type. The small bell above the front door rang cheerfully. I wiped my dirty hands on a rag and walked out to the front counter. It was Valerie. She looked completely different. The designer clothes were gone. She was wearing heavy, scuffed work boots and faded, stained jeans. She was much thinner, her skin deeply tanned and weathered from working entirely outside in the sun. Her hands, which used to be perfectly manicured, were rough, calloused, and covered in small healing cuts. "Hey," she said quietly, looking down at the concrete floor. "Hey," I said, putting down my heavy wrench. "How is the landscaping business?" "Hard," she admitted, her voice raspy. "Back-breaking?" "Yeah," I nodded slowly. She walked slowly over to the beautiful green Jaguar sitting in the bay. She did not reach out to touch the pristine paint. She just looked at it with genuine respect. "I came here to pay you back," she said suddenly. She reached deep into the pocket of her worn jacket and pulled out a slightly crumpled white envelope. She placed it carefully on my metal workbench. "What exactly is this?" I asked, not touching it. "It is $500, she said, looking me in the eye for the first time. "I know it does not even come close to covering the destroyed Porsche. I know Mom already paid Dad for that massive disaster. But, do you remember the front plastic bumper on your ugly Honda Civic when we were teenagers?" I stared at her, completely stunned into silence. "And the expensive digital camera I lost," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "And the college laptop I completely ruined." I sat down and did the actual math. "This envelope is not all of it, but it is a start." I looked down at the white envelope. Then I looked deeply at my younger sister. For the absolute first time in her entire life, she did not look like the entitled golden child. She looked like a tired, deeply regretful, ordinary woman. "Why are you doing this now?" I asked softly. "Because Dad was completely right," she said, her voice finally cracking. "I was entirely useless. I was a massive leech. Digging those deep holes in the dirt. I have a lot of quiet time to think about my life. I genuinely want to be different, Lorraine." I reached out and picked up the envelope. It felt incredibly heavy in my hand. Heavier than the silver Porsche key had felt. "Keep it," I said, holding it back out to her. "No, you have to take it," she insisted, pushing my hand away. "Put it in a high-yield savings account, Valerie," I instructed firmly. "Build your own financial safety net, because Mom absolutely cannot do it for you anymore." She nodded slowly, swallowing hard, fighting back tears. "But," I said, reaching over to the bench and picking up a rough sanding block. "If you genuinely want to pay me back, pick up that sandpaper. This vintage fender needs about 3 solid hours of wet sanding, and I currently charge $100 an hour for specialized labor. You give me 5 solid hours of work, and we will call the old Honda Civic debt completely even." Valerie looked closely at the rough sandpaper. She looked at my dirty hands. Then, she looked at my face. A small, incredibly genuine smile appeared on her weathered face. "Deal," she said. She immediately took off her heavy jacket, rolled up the sleeves of her flannel shirt, and started vigorously sanding the metal. The sharp sound of sandpaper violently scraping on metal is incredibly monotonous. It is a rhythmic, scratching whisper that can easily drive you completely insane if you do not genuinely love the slow process. For the first 2 grueling weeks, I watched Valerie struggle immensely with it. She was heavily used to instant gratification. Swipe left, swipe right, double tap a screen for a quick dopamine hit. Automotive restoration absolutely does not work that way. Restoration is incredibly slow. It is deeply painful. It physically forces you to directly confront your own mistakes, layer by agonizing layer. Valerie hated it at first. "My fingers are actually bleeding, Lorraine," she complained loudly on the 3rd day, holding up her blistered, raw hands. The harsh fluorescent lights of the shop made her look pale and exhausted. Stripped of the golden boy glow she had worn her entire life, she looked incredibly vulnerable. Wear thick leather gloves, I said simply, not even looking up from the intricate engine block I was carefully rebuilding. I absolutely cannot feel the fine grit of the metal with gloves on. She shot back irritably. I paused, holding my wrench in the air. That was exactly something I had patiently told her years ago, back when we were kids and I tried to teach her how to properly wax the Civic. She had actually remembered it. Then bleed, I said flatly. The blood washes off with soap. The rest does not. She did not quit. That was the absolute first massive surprise. I genuinely expected her to throw the sanding block, walk out the door after the very first week, go back to Mom's tiny apartment, and cry loudly until Mom magically found a way to bail her out of trouble again. But she consistently showed up every single morning at exactly 7 o'clock. She was late exactly twice, and I immediately deducted the lost time from the imaginary ledger of her massive debt. She did not argue once. She just worked significantly harder the next day to make it up. But the real, ultimate test was not the hard physical work. The real test was our mother. 3 weeks into Valerie's unofficial apprenticeship at the shop, Beverly walked through the front door. She looked entirely out of place among the heavy vintage chassis, the heavy steel tools, and the pungent smell of gasoline. She was wearing a long trench coat that looked expensive but was visibly older, one of the extremely few luxury items she had absolutely refused to sell during her financial downfall. She looked around the dirty shop with a potent mixture of deep disgust and total heartbreak. "Valerie!" she called out loudly. Her sharp voice echoed unpleasantly off the cold concrete walls. Valerie was currently lying under the heavy hydraulic lift, draining the thick, black oil from a 1972 Corvette. She slid out slowly on the plastic creeper, her face completely smeared with dark grease and sweat. "Mom?" she said, sitting up and wiping her forehead with a disgustingly dirty shop rag. "Oh, look at you." Mom rushed over frantically, completely ignoring the large, slippery oil stains on the floor. She knelt down quickly, instantly ruining her expensive stockings. "You look absolutely terrible. You look severely exhausted. This is not right." "I am actively working, Mom," Valerie said, standing up awkwardly. She looked incredibly uncomfortable with the sudden affection. "This is not real work. This is literal slave labor." Mom turned violently to me, her eyes flashing with that old, familiar, toxic fire. "Lorraine, how can you possibly do this to your own sister? She is your blood, not your hired servant. She has a college education. She has massive creative talent. She has a permanent criminal record and a massive mountain of debt, Mom," I said calmly, methodically wiping my own hands on a clean towel. "And she is actively learning a valuable trade. She is actually quite good at the fine detailing if she deeply focuses her mind. She absolutely should not be scrubbing dirty tires." Mom turned desperately back to Valerie and grabbed her greasy hands. "Baby, listen to me very closely. I finally found a way out of this nightmare. I met a man, a wealthy venture capital investor. He is incredibly interested in that brilliant app idea you had last year. The travel blog one." Valerie physically pulled her hands forcefully away from Mom's grip. "That app idea was a complete joke, Mom. It was literally just Instagram with a slightly different color filter. It was garbage." No, he absolutely loves the concept," Mom insisted, her eyes wide and manic. "He is fully willing to put up massive seed money. A huge salary. You could quit this disgusting dungeon today. You could be a successful CEO again." I watched Valerie closely. I held my breath. This was the exact moment of truth. The incredibly toxic drug was being directly offered to her again. Not heroin or alcohol, but pure, unearned validation. The seductive promise of the easy way out. The comfortable illusion that she was incredibly special without having to actually earn it. Valerie looked at Mom's desperate, pleading face. Then she looked down at the beautiful, partially restored Corvette. Then she looked directly at me. Does this wealthy investor know I am currently on strict legal probation? Valerie asked quietly. Does he know I legally cannot leave the state for travel? We absolutely do not have to tell him that minor detail yet. Mom whispered, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial hush. We can easily fudge the timeline dates. I can legally handle all the complicated paperwork. I still have some powerful contacts. So you want me to blatantly lie, Valerie said, her voice hardening. You want me to lie again? It is not lying. It is strategic marketing. Mom pleaded, tears welling up in her eyes. Valerie, please. I absolutely cannot stand seeing you live like this. It physically breaks my heart. You were always meant for vastly better things. Valerie took a slow, deliberate step backward. She reached down and picked up the heavy metal oil filter wrench from the floor. Mom, she said, her voice incredibly steady and calm. I recklessly wrecked a priceless Porsche. I almost killed myself and Lance. I completely ruined your entire life. You are currently living in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment next to a loud highway precisely because of my terrible actions. I do not care about the stupid house. Mom sobbed loudly, reaching for her. I only care about you. If you genuinely cared about me, Valerie said, and this time her voice cracked with deep, raw emotion, you would have let me completely fail 10 years ago. You would have let me return the Honda Civic when I destroyed it. You would not have secretly co-signed the loan for the Audi. I was desperately protecting you. Mom cried. You were completely crippling me. Valerie shouted, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet shop. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy and thick. The large air compressor suddenly kicked on in the corner of the room, a sudden, violent roar that made Mom physically jump in fear, but Valerie did not even flinch. I am absolutely not going with you, Mom, Valerie said with total finality. I am completely finishing this messy oil change, and then I am going to aggressively sand that metal fender until my fingers physically bleed again. Because for the absolute first time in my entire life, I know exactly what my true value is. I am worth exactly $10 an hour, and tomorrow, I am going to genuinely earn 11. Mom stood there, completely stunned into silence. She looked desperately at me, waiting for me to intervene, to be the cruel villain so she could swoop in and be the heroic savior. But I just leaned comfortably against the heavy workbench and crossed my arms over my chest, watching. Go home, Mom, I said gently. There is nothing left for you to fix here. She looked at Valerie one last, heartbreaking time, desperately waiting for her to change her mind and run into her arms. But Valerie simply turned her back to her, lay back down on the plastic creeper, and slid completely under the heavy car. Mom left. She did not slam the glass door. She did not yell. She just slowly faded out of the shop like a tired ghost finally realizing it no longer haunted the house. That late night, after we locked the front doors and closed up the shop, I opened the small office fridge and handed Valerie a cold beer. You okay? I asked quietly. She took a long, deep sip of the beer. She pawned her expensive diamond wedding ring, she said quietly, staring at the floor. I saw her left hand when she grabbed me. The large diamond is completely gone. She sold the absolute last valuable thing Dad gave her just to try and fund another one of my pathetic failures. She loves you, Valerie, I said softly. In her own incredibly twisted, toxic way. I know, she said, wiping a tear from her cheek. That is exactly why I absolutely cannot take her money anymore. It is pure poison. She looked up at me, her eyes determined. Hey, Lorraine. Teach me how to properly weld steel. I do not want to just sand metal anymore. I want to actually build something strong. We stayed incredibly late that night. I put a heavy welding mask over her face and patiently showed her how to run a clean bead of heat on a scrap piece of thick steel. She was absolutely terrible at it. She burned a massive, ugly hole right through the metal, ruining the piece completely. But she laughed. It was a real, genuine laugh. Not the high-pitched, performative cackle she used to do at fancy parties. 6 months slowly turned into a full year. Valerie officially moved out of Mom's depressing apartment and into a small, incredibly cramped studio apartment located directly above the auto shop. It was tiny, it constantly smelled heavily of engine oil and exhaust, and it had absolutely no view of the ocean. She absolutely loved it. She paid her own rent precisely on time every single month, using the salary she earned with her own 2 hands. Dad came by the shop occasionally. He never made a massive, theatrical show of it. He would simply bring his own personal car, a modern, sleek Mercedes, in for routine maintenance. He absolutely insisted on paying the full retail price for the labor. One quiet afternoon in late November, Dad walked slowly into the back bay where Valerie was intensely working on the complex interior of a 1965 Jaguar E-Type. It was a massive, highly lucrative project we had recently taken on for a very high-profile, wealthy client. Valerie was meticulously stitching the new tan leather tightly onto the center console. It was incredibly delicate work, requiring immense patience and a perfectly steady hand. Dad stood silently in the doorway for 10 full minutes, just watching her work. Valerie knew he was standing there, but she did not look up or seek his approval. She kept her sharp needle moving, deeply focused, breathing rhythmically. "The leather stitching is incredibly tight," Dad said finally, breaking the silence. Valerie looked up, wiping her brow. "It is a complex double French seam. Lorraine patiently showed me how to properly reinforce it underneath so it absolutely never splits over time." Dad nodded slowly. He walked over and ran his finger firmly along the stretched leather. He inspected it with the intense, unforgiving scrutiny of a man who built massive corporate skyscrapers. "Good," Dad said. "Acceptable." Coming from Arthur, acceptable was the equivalent of a massive standing ovation. Dad turned to face me. "Lorraine, I desperately need to review my complex estate planning. My corporate lawyer is currently drafting some massive updates regarding the family inheritance and the specific trust structures." Valerie immediately tensed up. I saw her shoulders physically hike up toward her ears. The word inheritance had always been a massive trigger in our family. It was a heavy weapon Mom constantly used to fiercely threaten us, or a golden carrot she endlessly dangled to control behavior. "I do not need absolutely anything, Dad," Valerie said quickly, putting her tools down. "I am completely good. I have a steady salary. I pay my rent." "I know you have a job, Valerie," Dad said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I can clearly see that. But this is absolutely not about charity. It is about business." Dad pulled a thick manila file from inside his suit jacket. "I am officially setting up a brand new corporate trust. It legally holds the valuable deeds to several of my massive commercial properties. I was originally going to leave it entirely to Lorraine, because frankly, I did not trust you with a single dollar bill, let alone an entire apartment building." Valerie flinched visibly but did not argue the harsh truth. However, Dad continued, opening the file. "Lorraine tells me you have shown incredible consistency. You have completely paid off your heavy court fees. You have stayed completely sober. You have not asked anyone for a single dime of help in over 12 months. Dad placed the heavy file onto the workbench. "I am legally rewriting the terms. The trust will be explicitly split 60-40. Lorraine gets the majority control because she has the proven business acumen, but you receive 40% of the quarterly dividends, provided you strictly stay employed and pass a random drug test annually. It is a safety net, Valerie. It is not a hammock. If you fall, it legally catches you. If you simply lie down and quit, it legally dumps you." Valerie looked down at the legal file. She did not reach out for it. "Put it entirely in Lorraine's name," Valerie said, her voice shaking but firm. Dad raised a thick eyebrow in surprise. "Excuse me?" "Put the whole entire thing in Lorraine's name," Valerie repeated, turning to look directly at me. "If I genuinely earn it, she will fairly give me my share of the dividends." If I violently relapse, or if I slowly turn back into the terrible person I was, I want her to have the absolute legal power to cut me off completely. I do not fully trust myself yet, Dad. Not with that massive kind of money. But I completely trust her. I felt a massive, painful lump immediately form in my throat. This was the actual sister I never had growing up. This was the strong woman who had been deeply buried under heavy layers of toxic entitlement and enabling for 25 years. Dad looked closely at Valerie for a very long time. Then, for the absolute first time in 20 years, he reached out his hand and warmly squeezed Valerie's shoulder. "Smart woman," Dad said, a rare smile appearing. "That is the absolute first smart financial decision you have ever made in your life." 18 months after the catastrophic crash, the green Jaguar E-Type was finally finished. It was an absolute mechanical masterpiece. The British racing green paint looked incredibly deep, almost like you could dive into it. The rich tan leather interior smelled exactly like expensive success. The rebuilt engine purred with that distinctive, aggressive inline-six harmony. It was not just an old car. It was a literal resurrection of dead metal. The wealthy client was scheduled to come pick it up on Saturday morning. But on Friday evening, as the sun was setting, I tossed the heavy silver keys directly to Valerie. "Take it out for a quick shakedown run on the highway," I said casually. Valerie caught the keys awkwardly. She looked utterly terrified, her eyes wide. "Absolutely no way, Lorraine. This is a $200,000 restored car. I am absolutely not driving it. What if?" I leaned comfortably against the garage door frame, smiling slightly. "What if what? What if I completely crash it?" she asked, her breathing accelerating. "What if you crash it?" I repeated calmly. "Then we simply bring it back here and we fix it together." "But you absolutely will not crash it. You are not the exact same driver you were 2 years ago. You deeply respect the heavy machine now. You intimately know exactly how much blood and skin is literally in the game." She hesitated, looking down at the gleaming, flawless metal of the hood. "I will ride shotgun with you," I offered, opening the passenger door. We slid down into the low, tight leather seats. Valerie methodically adjusted the rearview mirrors. She carefully checked to ensure the heavy gearshift was in neutral. She took a deep breath, inserted the key, and turned it. The powerful engine roared violently to life, a beautiful symphony of mechanical precision. She pulled slowly and carefully out of the garage. Absolutely no wheel spin. No aggressive revving. No showing off. She navigated the busy traffic of the small town with incredibly careful, deliberate movements. She religiously checked her blind spots. She kept massively safe distances from other vehicles. We finally hit the long, winding coastal highway. The exact same dark highway where she had violently destroyed the Porsche. I watched her white knuckles tightly gripping the wooden steering wheel. They were tense, but they were incredibly steady. As we rapidly approached the infamous lighthouse curve, I saw her gently ease her foot off the throttle. She downshifted the manual transmission incredibly smoothly, perfectly matching the engine revs. She took the sharp, sweeping corner exactly at the posted speed limit, hugging the inside apex perfectly. She did not even glance at the lighthouse or the new wooden guardrail. She kept her eyes locked fiercely on the road ahead. "You good?" I asked quietly over the wind. "Yeah," she let out a massive, shaking breath of relief. "I am completely good." We drove in comfortable, peaceful silence for a long while, just listening to the rush of the wind and the purr of the engine. It was a moment of pure, unspoken connection. We were not just sisters by blood anymore. We were actual partners. We were deeply scarred survivors of a quiet domestic war that had viciously claimed cars, houses, and marriages as collateral damage. "I invited Mom to Thanksgiving dinner tomorrow," Valerie said suddenly, not taking her eyes off the road. I physically stiffened in my seat. "You did?" "Yeah," she nodded slowly. She is not doing great, Lorraine." She is currently working long retail hours at a cheap department store, standing at the makeup counter all day. Her arthritis is getting incredibly bad. She looks very old and tired. She absolutely made her own choices, Valerie, I reminded her gently but firmly. I know, she said softly. And I am absolutely not asking you to magically fix her life. I am not asking Dad to swoop in and financially save her. I am just saying, she is our mom. And I genuinely think she desperately needs to see this. She needs to physically see that we actually survived her terrible help. I looked out the window at the vast, rolling ocean. The bright sun was slowly setting, painting the water in brilliant shades of purple, pink, and orange. Okay, I finally said, letting out a long sigh. But if she brings up a single fake investment opportunity or a new app idea, she eats her turkey outside on the cold porch. Valerie laughed loudly. Deal. Thanksgiving dinner was held at Dad's new house. It was a significantly smaller, much more modern, sleek place he had purchased after finally downsizing from the massive rental estates. It was just the four of us. Me, Valerie, Dad, and Mom. It was incredibly awkward at first. Mom arrived slowly in her old silver Lexus, which was now heavily dinged, scratched, and visibly dirty. She brought a cheap, store-bought pumpkin pie because she absolutely did not have a big, fancy kitchen to bake in anymore. She looked incredibly frail. The aggressive, toxic fire was completely gone from her eyes, entirely replaced by a heavy, weary resignation to her new reality. But the exact second she saw Valerie, her tired face lit up brilliantly. Not with the manic, artificial pride of before, but with genuine, deep relief. You look incredibly healthy, Mom said softly, reaching out to gently touch Valerie's weathered face. Valerie had filled out, her muscles physically hardened by the months of manual labor and lifting heavy auto parts. She looked entirely capable of handling the world. I am, Mom, Valerie said warmly, placing her rough hand over Mom's soft one. I am really, truly good. Dinner was surprisingly quiet but very civil. We completely avoided talking about the painful past. We did not mention the crushed PORSCHE, the massive financial debt, the ugly divorce, or the stressful court cases. We talked animatedly about the green Jaguar. We talked eagerly about the auto business actively expanding. Lorraine is actually letting me completely run the heavy paint booth starting next month, Valerie told them proudly, carefully cutting her piece of turkey. I have been aggressively practicing my complex spray patterns on scrap metal for weeks. I genuinely think I have the delicate touch for it. That is incredibly delicate work, Dad said, nodding approvingly at her. It requires a perfectly steady hand and extreme patience. She is vastly better at it than I am, I openly admitted, taking a sip of water. She actually has an artist's keen eye for it. I am just a logical engineer. She sees the subtle flow of the light on the curves vastly better than I ever could. Mom looked up at me, completely surprised by my compliment. You genuinely think she is talented? I absolutely know she is, Mom, I said firmly, looking right at her. She just desperately needed to stop pretending to be a fake millionaire and start actually being a real craftsman. Mom slowly looked down at her plate, her hands trembling slightly. I always knew she was incredibly special, she whispered softly. She is, Dad said, his voice carrying the heavy weight of absolute finality. Because she finally made herself special. She built it from the ground up. Nobody gave it to her. The profound distinction hung heavily in the warm air of the dining room. Nobody gave it to her. After dinner, the sun had fully set. We walked out onto the cold driveway to say our goodbyes. Mom walked slowly over to my dark Mustang, which was parked neatly next to Dad's Mercedes. Do you remember, she said quietly to me, gently tracing the cold metal hood of the Mustang with her finger, when you eagerly bought that horrible Honda? The incredibly ugly, rusted one? Hard to ever forget, Mom, I said dryly. Valerie violently ripped the entire bumper off on the second week. Mom winced visibly, closing her eyes. I was so incredibly angry at you that day. I genuinely thought you were being petty and cruel. I thought my absolute only job in the world was to make sure neither of you ever felt a single ounce of pain. I thought if you ever felt pain, I was a terrible, failing mother. She looked up at me, her eyes glistening wet in the glow of the porch light. I was completely wrong, Lorraine. Pain is the absolute only thing that actually teaches you exactly where the dangerous edge of the cliff is. It took a long while, Mom, I said gently. But we finally learned where the edge is. She turned slowly to Valerie. I am incredibly proud of you, Valerie. Not because you are rich. You are obviously not. And not because you are internet famous. But because when I look directly at you right now, I absolutely do not see a fragile child who desperately needs me to save her. I see a strong woman who can easily save herself. She hugged Valerie tightly. It was a desperate, clinging, deeply emotional hug. Then, she walked slowly to her beat-up Lexus, got in, and drove quietly away into the dark night. Dad stood casually on the porch, swirling a small glass of expensive scotch. She is completely right, you know. About what? Valerie asked, zipping up her heavy jacket against the cold. About the pain, Dad said softly, staring out into the darkness. I absolutely should have stepped in much sooner. I let her aggressively run the show because I cowardly did not want the constant conflict. I simply paid the massive bills and deliberately looked the other way. I am genuinely sorry for that, girls. I absolutely should not have let it get to the extreme point of a $325,000 lesson. It was an incredibly expensive tuition. Valerie grinned, a flash of white teeth in the dark. But I genuinely think I finally graduated. Dad chuckled, a low, warm sound. That you certainly did. Now get out of here. Both of you. I have a late date tonight. A date? I stared at him, my jaw dropping slightly. Who? Absolutely none of your business, Dad winked playfully. But she actively drives a vintage Alfa Romeo, and she strictly pays for her own commercial insurance. We all laughed loudly together. It was a genuinely good, healing sound that echoed into the night. I drove home later that night with the windows rolled completely down. The rushing air was freezing cold, heavily signaling the harsh coming winter, but I absolutely did not mind at all. I thought deeply about the pristine Porsche Speedster. Somewhere out there in a massive, dirty scrapyard, that incredibly beautiful white car was currently a compact cube of violently crushed metal. It was a massive tragedy of automotive engineering, sure. But as I looked up into my rearview mirror and saw the warm, steady glow of Valerie's headlights following closely behind me, steady, safe, and completely reliable, I realized an absolute truth. It was an incredibly fair trade. We had to brutally sacrifice a flawless German classic to fundamentally save an American family. The massive debt was finally paid in full. The heavy ledger was completely balanced. And for the absolute first time in my entire life, I was not constantly checking my blind spot, anxiously waiting for someone to secretly steal my keys. I was just driving. Eyes firmly forward, full speed ahead. This story was never just about a terrible car crash. It was fundamentally about the catastrophic crash of a toxic parenting philosophy. We very often confuse genuine love with obsessive protection. My mother honestly thought that heavily shielding Valerie from every single negative consequence was an act of profound love. But in harsh reality, she was actively stealing her ability to grow up. She was deliberately creating a permanent, helpless victim who arrogantly believed the entire world owed her a soft, comfortable landing. The Porsche moment was incredibly painful, massively expensive, and highly destructive. But it was absolutely necessary. It was the exact moment harsh reality finally hit significantly harder than my mother's endless excuses. True love is absolutely not about clearing the difficult path for someone else. It is about equipping them with the heavy boots they need to walk over the sharp rocks themselves. If you always eagerly pay the bail money, they absolutely never learn to stop committing the crime. If you always quickly replace the broken toy, they absolutely never learn to value the gift. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had to actively practice tough love with a difficult family member? Or were you the one who desperately needed to finally face the harsh consequences to completely turn your life around? What exactly was your massive PORSCHE moment? If you genuinely enjoyed the story and the powerful lesson it brings, please comment the word good down below. It clearly tells me that these incredibly honest stories about family responsibility and true redemption are strongly resonating with you. Your active interaction heavily helps more people organically find this channel, and maybe, just maybe, it helps another family wake up before their massive crash actually happens. Thanks for listening, and drive safe.